Before I tell you what I saw, I need to warn you about something. I am not a man who believes in love stories. I have ridden through 40 years of frontier dust, buried 2 partners, lost a homestead to fire, and watched enough sunsets alone to know that sentiment is a luxury most men out here cannot afford. I keep a field log, leather-bound, worn soft at the corners, not because I am poetic, but because memory lies. I write things down so I cannot pretend they happen differently later. That is the only reason I am writing this. Because what I witnessed between Caleb Merritt and a woman the Apache called Shige, which, as best I can translate, means something close to the one who came back, does not fit inside any category I have built for myself over these 40 years. It started as an arrangement, a negotiation. 2 people agreeing to share a life the way you agree to share a water source during a dry season, practically without ceremony, without the dangerous mistake of wanting it. They made one rule between them, just one. And I watched them break it, slowly, painfully, the way a man breaks a fever, not all at once, not with fanfare, but in the small hours when they thought no one was watching. The night they signed what Caleb called the agreement, I was 3 campfires away, close enough to hear the coyotes, but not close enough to hear words. What I saw was posture, and posture, in my experience, tells more truth than any spoken sentence. The agreement had no paper. That was the first thing that surprised me about Caleb Merritt. He was a man who measured everything, logged distances, counted water rations, named his horses in alphabetical order so he could track their ages without confusion. And yet when he stood across from the woman who would become his wife, there was no paper. Just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a fire, looking at each other the way 2 strangers look at a loaded pistol neither one wants to touch. I had known Caleb for 11 months by then. He came through the territory in the early part of the previous year, a survey man working for a railroad company that had already gone bankrupt twice and would go bankrupt a 3rd time before autumn. He was lean in the way that men become lean when they work instead of eating, with sun damage across the back of his neck and hands that were always slightly dirty regardless of how often he washed them. He kept 3 notebooks, one for survey measurements, one for weather observations, and one smaller, tucked into his inside vest pocket, that he called his thinking log, which he would not show anyone and which I only glimpsed once when it fell open in the wind. The page I saw had a single sentence written across it in his careful handwriting. Things I do not understand yet. That was it, just the heading, below it nothing, as if the list was ongoing. He came to the Apache winter camp through a chain of necessity that I will try to explain without losing you. The railroad survey work had dried up. He had taken a contract to map water sources for a cattle operation in the eastern part of the territory, which required him to move through land that no rancher's foreman wanted to ride without some kind of passage agreement with the bands that moved through it. He had approached the camp, cautiously, with appropriate gifts, without the arrogance that got men killed, and had been received with the particular kind of neutral evaluation that an Apache elder gives to someone who is not yet an enemy and not yet a friend. The elder's name was Nantage. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, small and unhurried, with a quality of stillness that I had only ever seen in one other person, and that person was a dead man. Nantage listened to Caleb's purpose through a translator, asked questions that were precise and unexpectedly philosophical. Why does a railroad need to know where water is? Does the iron road not carry its own? And then was quiet for a long time. Then he told Caleb something the translator rendered carefully, pausing between each phrase as if testing the weight of the words before setting them down. There is a woman in this camp who needs a husband, not for love, for protection. There are men, not Apache men, white men, who come looking for her because of land her father registered before he died. If she is married to a man from the settler world, those men have less legal claim to pursue her. You need passage. She needs a name on a document. This can be a trade. Caleb had looked at the translator for a long moment, then at Nantage. She knows about this proposal, he asked. She made it, the translator said. That was the first thing I learned about the woman they called Shige. Her name on the land document, the document from her white father's estate, was Clara Dunmore. But in the camp she was Shige, and the distinction mattered more than I initially understood. Her father had been a surveyor too, which I later thought about more than was probably useful. She had grown up between 2 worlds and belonged completely to neither, which is a particular kind of loneliness that I am not sure there is a word for in any language I speak. Her Apache mother had died when she was 12. Her father had died 3 years ago, leaving her a narrow strip of land along a creek that suddenly became interesting to certain men when a new road was rumored to pass through it. She was 26 years old, had dark hair she kept braided tight against her skull, and had a habit of going very still when she was thinking, not the stillness of someone waiting for something to happen, but the stillness of someone who had already decided what they would do and was now conserving energy for the doing of it. The first time I saw them speak directly to each other, not through Nantage, not through the translator, was 4 days after the agreement was made, and 1 day before the quiet ceremony that would legally bind them. They were sitting at opposite ends of a fallen log near the camp's water source, both of them apparently there by coincidence, both of them clearly aware that it was not coincidence. I was upwind and slightly above, resting my own horse on the ridge. I could not hear what they said, but I watched them both look at the water for a while without speaking, and then I watched Caleb open his thinking log, the private one, the one he showed no one, and turn it toward her. She looked at it, she looked at him. Then she reached into her own coat and produced something. I was too far away to see what, and held it out to him. He took it. I do not know what was exchanged. I wrote unknown exchange near water source, day 4 in my field log, and circled it, because I knew it was going to matter later, and I did not yet know why. The ceremony happened the next morning. An Apache elder spoke words I did not fully understand. A document was signed, the one that would protect her land claim, the one that bore his name alongside hers. They stood next to each other with perhaps 8 inches of air between them. When it was done, Nantage looked at both of them with an expression that I can only describe as patient amusement, the way a very old man looks at 2 young people who have not yet understood the joke they are standing inside. After Caleb went to write in his survey log, Clara Scheij went to help an older woman carry water from the source. Neither of them spoke to each other again that day. The rule, as Caleb explained it to me that evening, he came to my fire, which surprised me, because he was not naturally a sociable man, was simple. We agreed on the terms, he said, accepting the coffee I offered without being asked. The arrangement lasts as long as she needs protection from the land claim. When that's resolved, either the road doesn't come through or she secures it legally, we dissolve it, quietly, without complication. Whose idea was the rule? I asked. He looked at the fire. Mutual. Which rule? He looked at me then with the expression of a man who had expected the question, and was annoyed that it had been asked anyway. We don't, he stopped, started again. We agreed that feelings would complicate what is essentially a legal and practical arrangement. So the rule is that neither of us will allow that. Allow feelings. Allow feelings to become operative, he said, with the precision of a man who believed that wording could contain things. I drank my coffee. I did not say anything. It's a reasonable rule, he said, to his coffee rather than to me. I didn't say it wasn't, I said. He left shortly after. I wrote in my field log. I wrote, C. Merritt believes rules are walls. He has not yet noticed that he builds them around things he is already afraid of losing. I have been wrong about people before. I want to be clear about that. I am not a prophet. I am a man who watches things and writes them down. And sometimes the notes are wrong, and sometimes they are right, and the only value in the exercise is that you cannot revise them afterward. But I was not wrong about that one. The weeks that followed were, on the surface, unremarkable. Caleb continued his water source survey, moving in a broad loop through the territory but returning to the camp every 4 or 5 days in the way that a man returns to a base camp, practically without sentiment. Scheij continued her own work, which was various and skilled, and which I will describe because it matters to understanding who she was. She was the person in the camp that people came to with things that were broken. Not just physical things, tools, harnesses, the framework of a shelter after a wind, but other things too, disputes, worries, children who had stopped speaking after something frightening. She had a quality that I have encountered in perhaps 4 or 5 people in my entire life, which is the quality of making you feel that your problem is both entirely serious and entirely manageable simultaneously. She did not minimize things, but she also did not catastrophize. She just looked at the problem or the person with that still measuring attention, and then she said what she thought plainly, and then she helped if she could. I watched Caleb notice this about her, I watched him try not to. It happened gradually, the way erosion happens, not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small ones. He started coming back to camp in 3 days instead of 5. He started bringing things, a particular kind of dried fruit that she had mentioned in passing she had not tasted in years, a new style of brass fitting that she needed for a repair, once a small carved wooden figure that he said he had found abandoned near a prospector's camp and thought might be useful for, and here his wording became oddly vague, something. She kept the wooden figure, I noticed that. She, for her part, began leaving things near the area where he set up his bedroll when he was in camp, a folded blanket when the temperatures dropped, a prepared meal when he came in late and the communal fire was low. Once, and this is the one I wrote down and underlined, a page torn from a book. I could not see the title of the book. I could not read what was on the page, but I watched him pick it up, read it, fold it carefully, and put it in his inside vest pocket. Not in the survey log, not in the weather log. In the thinking log. I wrote, something is happening that neither of them will acknowledge. I give it 3 more weeks. I was generous with the estimate. What broke the surface first was not a moment of warmth. It was an argument. I was present for the argument because it happened in earshot of the camp fire, where I was eating a late meal with Nantage and the translator. Nantage did not look up during it. The translator looked at me. I looked at my food. The argument was about the land document. Caleb had received information from his contacts in the town 2 days' ride east that the men pursuing the claim on her creekside land were planning to file a challenge through a territorial court on the grounds that her father's original registration had a procedural flaw. The challenge was probably beatable, but it required her to appear in the territorial town in person, to submit herself to a legal process in a world that had consistently treated her as neither fully one thing nor another. He had come back to camp to tell her, and he had, in his methodical way, also prepared a plan, a sequence of steps, dates, the names of a lawyer in the town who owed him a professional courtesy, the specific documents she would need to bring. What he had not done was ask her what she wanted to do. "You made a plan," she said. Her voice was flat in the way that flat voices are dangerous. "Without asking me. I made a plan to protect the land." "My land?" "Yes. Which I have been managing and fighting for since before you had any involvement in my life." She was not loud. She was the opposite of loud. "I have been navigating this territory, both of them, the legal one and this one, for 3 years without anyone making plans about my life without consulting me. I don't need a plan." "I need to be asked." Caleb was quiet for a moment. I could see him processing, the slight tightening around his eyes, the very small movement of his hands that meant he was fighting the impulse to reach for his notebook. "I should have asked," he said. It was not what she expected him to say. I could see that. "Yes," she said, "you should have." Another silence. Nantage, beside me, sipped his tea with the serenity of a man watching whether he had predicted 3 days ago. "What do you want to do?" Caleb asked. She looked at him. The stillness in her was different now, not the stillness of conservation, but the stillness of recalibration, of revising a conclusion. "I want to go to the town," she said. "I want to bring the documents my father left me. And I want to walk into that court looking like exactly what I am, not like what will be most comfortable for the men in that room." "That might make it harder." "I know what it will make it." Her voice was neither hard nor soft. It was exact. "Will you go with me?" The question was practical. It was exactly the kind of question their arrangement allowed for. He was her husband, legally, and his presence in that courthouse would carry weight that hers alone would not, and they both knew this, and the asking of it was entirely within the logic of their agreement. And yet, the way he answered, it was not within the logic of their agreement. "I'll go wherever you need me to go," he said, simply. Without the careful wording, without the qualifications he applied to every other statement he made. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire cracked. Somewhere across the camp, a child made a sleepy sound. She nodded once, then she walked away. Caleb stood there for a moment after she left. Then he reached into his vest, took out the thinking log, and added something to it. I was too far away to read the page. "I wrote in my own log, the rule is already broken. They just haven't admitted it yet. I was right about that one too. I have a habit that has served me poorly at card tables and well everywhere else. I notice the thing that doesn't match. The single worn button on an otherwise new coat. The man who laughs 1/2 second after everyone else. The sentence that is a little too carefully composed to have been spoken without rehearsal. This habit is why I keep the field log, and it is why I knew, before either of them did, what the ride to the territorial town was going to cost them. We left camp on a Tuesday, which Caleb noted in his survey log because he noted everything with a date and a weather observation. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and pressed, the kind of sky that does not rain so much as exhale. There were 4 of us: Caleb, Shige, a young Apache man named Da who served as additional security at Nantage's quiet insistence, and myself, invited along by Caleb in a way that was phrased as a question but was actually a request. He wanted a witness. I was the kind of man who could be a witness in 2 worlds, and he knew that about me. We rode in a loose line, Da in front, then Shige, then Caleb, then me at the back where I could watch all of them. The first half of the first day was silent in the way that groups of people are silent when they are each inside their own version of what is about to happen. Then Caleb moved his horse up to ride beside Shige. He did not say anything at first. He just rode alongside her, which was either companionable or territorial or both, and which she acknowledged with a slight tilt of her head before returning her attention to the trail. "You've been to this town before," he said, not a question. "3 times, she said. Once with my father when I was 9. Once when he died and I had to register the estate. Once last year when the first challenge was filed." "How was it?" She looked at him sideways. "You're asking how the town treated me." "I'm asking how you experienced being there." The distinction was small and deliberate, and she registered it. I could see it in the barely perceptible softening around her eyes. "Like a question," she said. "I always feel like a question in places like that. People look at me and they can't quite categorize what they're seeing, and it makes them uncomfortable, and that discomfort usually lands on me." She paused. "I have learned to walk into a room before anyone expects me, to already be seated when they arrive. It removes one opportunity for them to decide what I am." Caleb was quiet. "Then that's a good tactic." "It's not a tactic," she said. "It's survival, a beat, but thank you." They rode in silence again, but it was different silence. The kind that exists between people who have just shared something real and are now giving it room to settle. I wrote in my field log, first voluntary disclosure, day 1 of ride. She didn't have to tell him any of that. She chose to. The town was called Ridgeway, which I had always thought was a name that suited its personality. It implied height and perspective that the place did not actually have. It was a mid-sized territorial town with 3 competing churches, 1 functioning saloon, a land office that smelled of old paper and ambition, and a courthouse that had been built to suggest authority without quite achieving it. We arrived late in the afternoon of the 2nd day, with enough time to secure rooms at the boarding house before the last light failed. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who was efficient and observant in the way of women who operate public accommodations in places where public life is complicated. She looked at our party with the neutral assessment of someone who had seen stranger combinations come through her door and had learned that the character of guests was better determined by their behavior than by their appearance. She gave us 2 rooms, 1 for Da, 1, after a glance at Shige and Caleb, for the married couple. I was given a cot in the back hallway, which suited me. What happened in that room that night, I cannot tell you, because I was not there and I do not fabricate what I do not witness. What I can tell you is what I observed in the morning. Caleb came to breakfast first. His shirt was clean. He had brought a clean shirt, I noticed, which was not a man's typical practical priority for a legal proceeding, and he had shaved, which he usually did with the same regularity he applied to other maintenance tasks, but which on this morning he had done more carefully. He sat with his coffee and his survey log and wrote something in it. But then he stopped writing, and for a moment he just held the pen and looked at the wall with an expression that I can only describe as a man looking at a conclusion. He has been avoiding for some time, and finding that it has been there, patient and unchanged, waiting for him to look. Then Shige came to breakfast. She was dressed in a way I had not seen before. The braid was gone, her hair was down and pinned in a style that was neither Apache nor what I would have called frontier settler, but something that was specifically and deliberately her own. She wore the coat her father had left her, dark wool, fitted, with the particular gravity of an inherited garment that has been cared for precisely because it cannot be replaced. She carried the leather case with the documents. She walked into the room, and she was already seated before either Caleb or I had fully registered that she had arrived. She looked at Caleb. "How do I look?" she said. It was not the question of a woman seeking reassurance. It was the question of a soldier checking their equipment before engagement. Caleb looked at her. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds, which is a long time to hold someone's gaze across a breakfast table. "Like someone who belongs in that room," he said. Something moved in her face quickly, almost too quickly to catch, and then it was gone. "Good," she said. "That's the right answer." The courthouse hearing was not dramatic in the way that makes for easy telling. Courtroom proceedings in territorial towns rarely are. It was 4 hours of document examination, procedural argument, and the particular exhaustion of watching a room full of men perform certainty about things they are not actually certain of. The lawyer Caleb had arranged, a thin man named Coral with extraordinarily clean fingernails, was competent and measured. The men challenging the land claim were represented by a heavyset attorney who kept referring to the situation with the Dunmore estate, in a tone that implied the situation was a problem of nature rather than of their own manufacturing. Shige sat through all of it with the stillness I had come to recognize as her primary form of armor. She answered questions when asked. She produced documents at the right moment, in the right order, as if she had rehearsed the sequence, which she had, I knew, because I had watched her organize the leather case the night before with the precision of someone who understood that order communicates competence to people looking for reasons to dismiss you. There was one moment that I will write down because it was the first moment where I saw the rule visibly straining. The opposing attorney, making some point about the legitimacy of her father's registration, referred to her with a grammatical construction that managed, in a single sentence, to question both her identity and her standing. It was done smoothly, with the ease of a man accustomed to doing such things without consequence. It was the kind of small violence that leaves no visible mark. Shige did not react. She was too skilled at that particular restraint. But Caleb reacted. It was nothing dramatic, not the kind of thing that would have been noted by anyone else in the room. He shifted in his seat, the slight forward lean of a man whose instinct is to respond to something and who is controlling that instinct by exactly the width of a hair. His hand, which had been resting open on the table, closed into a loose fist and then opened again. And then, without looking at her, without any performance of it, he moved his hand across the table and placed it over hers. Not a squeeze, not a gesture of comfort, just presence. Just his hand resting over hers on the table, in plain view of the room, in plain view of the attorney who had just done what he had done. She looked down at their hands. She looked up at him. He was looking at the attorney. She turned her hand over under his and let their fingers settle. They stayed that way for perhaps 4 minutes, until the attorney moved on to a different document and the moment changed. I wrote nothing in my field log during the hearing. I was afraid to break the quality of attention I was paying. Coral won the procedural point. The challenge to the land registration was deferred for further review, which in territorial law was as close to victory as you typically got on the first attempt. It did not resolve the situation permanently. There would be future filings, future hearings, but it protected the land for now, and it put the men on the other side in a costlier and more complicated position. Walking out of the courthouse, Da went ahead to see about the horses. Coral stopped Caleb for a brief consultation. Shige and I walked out together into the afternoon, which had gone clear and sharp while we were inside. She stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked at the street below, and I stood beside her. "You all right?" I asked. "I'm calculating," she said. "What are you calculating?" "How much longer this will take," she said, "to resolve fully so that the arrangement—" She stopped. Something changed in her face, not dramatically, but in the way that the landscape changes when a cloud moves, and for a moment you see the color of things without the shadow. "So that the arrangement can conclude," she finished. I looked at her. "Is that what you want?" I asked, "for it to conclude?" She looked at the street for a long moment. "I want what I agreed to," she said carefully. It was the most exact and the most dishonest thing I had heard her say. Caleb came out of the courthouse then, and she turned toward him, and the expression she had been wearing when she said that, the brief, uncaged one, the one that told me things she had not said, was gone. She was shy again, composed, deliberate herself. But I had seen it, I wrote it down. That evening, we ate in the boarding house's common room, all four of us, and it was different from the silence of the ride there. It was the particular ease of people who have gone through something together and come out on the other side with their dignity intact. Da, who had been mostly quiet throughout, told a story about a horse he had once stolen back from 3 different men in 3 different ways, and even Caleb laughed, genuinely, not the polite approximation of a laugh. And for a moment the common room smelled like food and sounded like people who trusted each other. At some point during the meal, Shige said something in a low voice to Caleb. I was talking to Da and only caught the rhythm of it, not the words. He looked at her. He said something back. She smiled. It was the smallest smile I had ever seen accomplish so much. I looked away. Some things a witness should give privacy to. The ride back to camp took 3 days instead of 2. The weather had changed, not badly, but in the way that weather changes when it is reminding you that it is in charge, and we took a longer route to avoid a flooded crossing. The slower pace required us to camp 2 nights on the trail. The first night, Caleb took the first watch while the others slept. I stayed up on the grounds of my own insomnia, genuine this time, not strategic, and sat with him near the banked fire. He was writing in his thinking log. "You can ask," he said without looking up. "I wasn't going to ask anything," I said. "You were composing the question," he said. "I can hear it. You have a habit of exhaling through your nose, right before you ask something you've been sitting on." I had not been aware of that habit. I made a note of it. "Fine," I said, "the rule." He looked up. "How's the rule?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. In the firelight, his face had the quality of something being slowly developed. The way a daguerreotype plate slowly resolves an image in the chemicals, the shapes emerging from blur into clarity. "I believe," he said, with the care of a man who has been rehearsing the sentence but cannot quite make it sound unrehearsed, "that the rule may have been poorly designed." "In what way?" He looked at the fire. "It assumed that practical proximity and shared difficulty and mutual," he stopped, started again. "It assumed that if we agreed not to feel something, we would not feel it. And it turns out," he said, with the precise, pained expression of a scientist recording a result that disproves his hypothesis, "that agreement and outcome are not always the same thing." I waited. "I don't know what to do with that," he said, quietly. The way a man admits something when he has run out of the energy to keep not admitting it. "Have you talked to her?" "No." "Why not?" He was very quiet. "Because the arrangement was her idea," he said, finally. "The rule was her idea, and she is not a woman who makes ideas carelessly. If she made that rule, she made it for reasons, and I am not certain it is my right to." He stopped again. "I don't want to make it harder for her. Whatever she needs from this arrangement, I would rather," he exhaled, "I would rather do whatever makes it easier for her." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the courthouse, about his hand on the table, about the way he had said, "I'll go wherever you need me to go," as if the words had arrived before the intention. "Caleb," I said. "What?" "What she needs from the arrangement," I said carefully, "might have changed." He looked at me. "I'm just writing what I observe," I said, and I tapped my field log, and he understood what I meant, and he looked back at the fire. He did not respond, but he opened the thinking log again and added something to the page. I did not see what he wrote. I gave it privacy. The second night of the camp, I took a watch from midnight to early morning. The sky had cleared by then, and there was enough moonlight to see by. The camp was quiet. At some point, 2 in the morning, perhaps 2:30, I heard movement near the tree line and turned ready. It was Shige. She had woken and come outside, which was not unusual. She slept lightly, I had observed, the sleep of someone who had learned to stay close to the surface. She did not see me immediately. She stood at the edge of the moonlight with her arms folded around herself and looked at the sky for a while. Then she looked at where Caleb was sleeping. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and took something out. I could see it in the moonlight. It was the wooden figure he had brought her from the prospectors' camp, the small carved one, She had been carrying it. She held it for a moment, put it back in her pocket. Walked back to her bedroll. I wrote nothing in my field log. Some things should not be made into a record. Some things are between a person and the night sky and the small carved thing they carry in their pocket, and the only respectful act is to not make them into evidence. But I remembered it, and I am writing it now because this is not a legal record. This is something else. This is a witness account of the moment a rule finishes dying. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break with a sound. It just releases like a held breath. Like a fist that has been clenched too long finally, in the dark, in the private hours, opening. Here is what I know about the way people avoid admitting something true. They get very busy. They develop an extraordinary number of tasks that need immediate attention. They become efficient, organized, purposeful in ways that are just slightly too emphatic to be entirely about the tasks themselves. I have done this myself. I am doing it right now, in fact. I have been sharpening the same pencil for 3 minutes while I decide how to write this last section. Some truths resist the pen. That's how you know they're worth writing. We returned to camp on a Saturday, which I noted because the camp was busy with the particular energy of a Saturday. A gathering of several families who came in on a rotating schedule. The particular noise and commerce of people who had been separately working all week and were now briefly in the same place. Nantage greeted us with his usual unhurried assessment of the situation, heard the outcome of the hearing from Shige in their language, and nodded in the way that someone nods when something has confirmed what they already expected. Then he looked at Caleb and said something. He says, the translator told Caleb, that you have done a useful thing. Tell him I was glad to help, Caleb said. Nantage spoke again. The translator paused in a way that suggested translation was not his difficulty. Then, he says that useful is not the same as done. Caleb looked at Nantage. Nantage looked back at him with those small, patient, infuriating eyes. I don't, Caleb started. He knows what he said, the translator said very quietly. He says you will also know when you're ready. Caleb spent that afternoon on his survey work, or what he called his survey work, which increasingly I suspected had become a pretext for solitary thinking rather than actual measurement. He had a quality I had noticed in him over these months. He processed emotion through locomotion. He needed to move when something was working itself out in him. He would pace or ride or walk survey lines that didn't strictly need walking. I left him to it. What I attended to instead was Shige. She had gone, after the greeting and the brief account of the hearing, to the work of the camp. There was always work. She helped repair a shelter frame that had shifted in the week's wind. She sat with a young woman who had been unwell and needed company more than medicine. She organized, assessed, contributed, moving through the camp with the calm efficiency I had always admired in her. But she was distracted. I noticed it in the small ways, the second-long pause before she answered a direct question, as if she had been somewhere else and was returning. The way her eyes moved once, twice, toward the direction Caleb had gone. The way she reached into her coat pocket, not producing anything, just touching something inside it. The carved figure. Late in the afternoon, Nantage found me at my usual place, slightly apart from the main activity, with a view of the whole, and sat down beside me without ceremony. We had developed a comfortable arrangement, he and I, based on mutual respect and the shared understanding that we were both, in different ways, observers of the human condition. He said something in Apache. He wants to know, the translator supplied. The young man had followed Nantage with the weary acceptance of someone who has accepted that he will be translated everywhere. What you have written in your log about these two. I was surprised. I looked at Nantage. He knows about my log. He knows about most things, the translator said, with a note of personal experience. I considered. Then I opened the field log to the first entry I had made about them, the one from the night of the agreement, the one about posture. I turned it toward Nantage, who could not read English but who looked at it with the attention he gave to everything. Tell him, I said, that I have been writing about two people who made an agreement to avoid something and have spent several months failing at it. The translator translated. Nantage listened. Then he said something short. He says, the translator said, with the careful neutrality of someone working hard not to editorialize, that the real agreement was not the one they spoke aloud. I looked at Nantage. He looked back. Then he stood, with the slow grace of a man who has stopped hurrying because he has had enough experience to know that hurrying rarely changes outcomes, and walked away. I sat with that for a while. The breaking of the rule, the actual, spoken, acknowledged breaking of it, happened that evening. I was not present for it. I am clear about that. I was not present, I did not overhear it, and I am not going to invent the words of a private conversation for the sake of a complete narrative. What I can tell you is what I observed before and after. Before, Shige finished the evening meal and helped clean the cooking area, as was her habit. Then, instead of joining the circle of women who typically gathered after the meal for conversation, she walked in the direction Caleb had gone. She walked with her usual composure, but there was something deliberate in the direction, not the direction of anything she needed, but the direction of someone specific. She had the carved figure in her hand. I saw that much before the dark took her. After it was an hour later, perhaps more, I had given up waiting. Not that I had been waiting, I had simply not gone to sleep when they came back into the firelight together. Not touching. Side by side, with perhaps a foot of air between them, which was more than 8 inches, which is the direction toward rather than away. Both of them stopped at the edge of the firelight and seemed to remember simultaneously that other people existed. Caleb looked at the fire. Shige looked at the fire. Then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that I could not have described then and cannot now. It is the kind of thing that has no vocabulary in any language I speak. They went to their separate sides of the camp, but the air was different. The particular quality of strain that had been building for months, the strain of 2 people in proximity to something they were not naming, was gone, replaced by something else. Not resolution, something more tentative than that and also somehow more solid. In the morning, I found a note tucked into the cover of my field log. It was in Caleb's handwriting, 2 sentences. I know you've been watching. Thank you for keeping the record. I folded it and put it in my field log, between the entry about the exchange at the water source and the entry about the courthouse. Then Caleb sat down next to me with his coffee. Well, I said. Well, he said. We drank coffee for a while. I told her, he said, what I'd been, he paused, what I had been experiencing for some time. And she told me, he said, that she had thrown away 3 different versions of telling me the same thing. That she kept drafting the conversation and deciding that the arrangement. The rule, he said, with the expression of a man reviewing a document that he knows contains errors but that he wrote himself, had been made to protect both of us from exactly what had already happened. So there was no logical, he stopped, made a slight, helpless gesture with his coffee cup. She said that she had decided that the rule was protecting the wrong thing. What was it protecting? Fear, he said. She said it was a fence around fear dressed up as practicality. I looked at him. She said that, I said. She did, he drank his coffee. She's very precise. What did you say? He was quiet for a moment. I told her I had written something in my thinking log that I had been afraid to say aloud, he said, and I showed her the page. What was on the page? He looked at me with the expression of a man who has decided, after some deliberation, that I have earned a certain amount but not an unlimited amount. Private, he said. Fair enough, I said. We drank coffee in silence. The camp was waking around us, the sounds of morning, fire being fed, water being carried, children's voices starting up. What happens now, I asked, with the arrangement? He looked into his coffee. We've been discussing that, he said. The land challenge isn't resolved permanently. There will be more hearings, probably, so the legal arrangement still serves a function. A pause. But there's the other arrangement, the rule. You're dissolving it. He looked for a word. We're replacing it with something that doesn't require us to agree not to feel things. I looked at him. Caleb, I said. What? That's what people usually call a marriage, I said. He looked at me. Then slowly, the way morning comes in the winter, without drama, just a gradual and certain accumulation of light, he smiled. I know, he said, I know what it is. The weeks that followed were, I will not pretend they became simple. Nothing about their situation was simple. The legal challenge to the land would require 2 more trips to Ridgeway over the following year. There were men in the territory who remained interested in the Creekside land, and that interest was not benign, and managing it required vigilance. Caleb's survey work continued, with its absences and returns. Shai's life remained what it was, a life lived across a seam in the world, in a territory that was still deciding how to categorize her. But something had changed in the quality of the difficulty. It was not the same to carry a hard thing when you are carrying it alone as it is to carry it when someone is walking beside you who knows the weight of what you have in your hands. I observed this, I wrote it down. 3 months after the courthouse, I left the territory. Not because of anything dramatic. My own surveying contract had come through, a long loop through land I had been commissioned to map. I said my farewells to Nantage, who regarded my departure with his customary equanimity. I shook hands with Da, who had decided he liked me by then, and expressed this by insulting me once in Apache with a grin. Caleb walked with me to my horse. "You'll finish the thinking log," I said. "At some point," he said, "the list is getting shorter. Things you don't understand yet. Some of them have explanations now," he said. We shook hands, I mounted. Shai was across the camp, sitting with Nantage, doing something with her hands, some repair or craft. I was too far to see clearly. She was not looking at us. But as I turned my horse to leave, she looked up, looked at me, and she raised one hand briefly. I raised mine. I rode out. I did not write anything in my field log until I had cleared the camp boundary and was on to the open land, and the morning was still and wide around me, and my horse was moving at an easy pace. Then I stopped, opened the log to a fresh page, wrote the date and location. Below that I wrote, "The rule was broken, both parties complicit, no regrets recorded on either side. Outcome classified, not what was agreed upon, better than what was agreed upon." Then I thought for a moment and added one more line. The real agreement, the one Nantage meant, was always the one neither of them spoke aloud. The one they were making the whole time, in exchanges near water sources and courthouse tables, and the particular way a hand rests over another hand when nothing else can say the right thing. Some agreements don't need a rule. Some things don't need a rule to hold. I closed the log, tucked it into my saddlebag. Rode on. Behind me the camp settled into its morning. A fire was fed. A child ran between two shelters laughing about something. And somewhere in that ordinary, irreplaceable life, two people were going about the day they had chosen, not because it was what they had agreed to, but because it was what they had arrived at together, the slow and genuine way. I did not look back. I already had what I needed for the record.